keep in mind when we say resource-rich developing economies, we mean economies essentially that have a high amount of natural resources, and they are still in the stage of developing or emerging. The first of the two that I want to mention is easier as well as cheaper access to finance. That is one that really helps to lessen the sharpness with which inequality can occur in a society. The reason why is that if one thinks about it, if you have a group, maybe let's use an example from in one of the countries in Africa that are resource-rich developing economies. If you have maybe let's say a tribal group that has historically they've been unable to accumulate a certain amount of capital. If someone from that tribal group wants to then enter into entrepreneurship, they do not have historical capital, whether it's amongst themselves or whether it's amongst their family, to be able to access the opportunities that go along with entrepreneurship. And so it is important that groups that are vulnerable or groups that have been disadvantaged generally, as well as micro, small and medium-sized enterprises, have easier as well as cheaper access to finance. In Guyana, it is especially pronounced for micro, small and medium-sized enterprises for them to have cheaper as well as easier access to finance. That is one way in which we can ensure that enterprises that we may not see their full potential in a situation where they cannot have capital, that we are able to provide the conditions under which those companies can thrive. That will in itself help to regulate or dissipate some of the inequalities that can end up happening. Think about, let's maybe bring it to a practical example. Think about someone who is highly skilled in some technical field. Maybe let's say they're doing perhaps engineering, or if they're maybe not even that technical, they're doing recruitment. They are exceptional at what they do, but they cannot have access to capital to be able to further their enterprise. They can't have access to working capital to be able to pay staff, maybe say if they are in a shortfall of cash or something of the sort. That person will be forced to close their business, or they will be forced to cap their business at a certain level. That by itself will exacerbate an inequality. And so cheaper as well as easier access to finance is one that really drives home at reducing inequality, especially as it relates to micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises. And then the last one that I want to advance is that of the implementation of a sovereign wealth fund, or the implementation, in our Guyanese context, of a natural resources fund, or a natural resource fund as it's now known. Why is that being brought up for inequality? Because we're approaching inequality from multiple dimensions. We're approaching it from, business size, urban and rural, etc. But now we're looking at inequality in terms of intergenerational. There have been situations in resource-rich developing economies where the level of extraction that occurs at perhaps where we are at this point in time, and the level of spend that then concomitantly occurs as a result of that level of extraction, means that a lot of the resources are being spent today. All of it cannot be spent on long-lasting infrastructure. Some of it will have to be spent on other dimensions of growth and economic development, naturally. But it's important to remember that the assets that we are leveraging today belong to Guyanese of today as well as Guyanese in the future. And so it is important through the implementation of a natural resource fund or through the implementation of a sovereign wealth fund to ensure that some amount of that money is saved for future generations so as to avoid long-term inequality or disadvantage to the groups that will emerge in the future or population that will emerge in the future. So those 5 areas for me, the 3 big tickets that I spoke about, healthcare, infrastructure, education, and then the 2 of access to finance, cheaper and easier access to finance, as well as the implementation of the natural resource fund or the sovereign wealth fund. I think those 5 areas really do serve as a strong basis upon which we can reduce inequalities and tackle inequalities from multiple dimensions, not a unidimensional view of inequality. And so, sorry for being a bit long-winded on it, but it is a concept or a construct that really deserves full exploration. And so I'll offer that for us to kick off the discussion this evening.
Well, that was a very comprehensive response there, Richard, and I appreciate that you took the time to truly delve into the different areas upon which we can really make a difference in really addressing inequalities in the society. So thank you very much for that. And what I'm getting from you is that the government has a unique opportunity to use our oil resources in such a manner that it can address, because what you've outlined there are some really tangible things that can be executed for us to address inequalities in the society. And even with what you've explained, it's clear that we can easily avoid oil and gas becoming the Achilles heel of our economy, which has happened to many other oil-producing nations, like Nigeria, for example. So with that, Richard, I'd like to go to our next question, which is also related. There are criticisms that the government is not doing enough to address inequality. And there are those who push the message that the oil would actually become the wealth of sorrow. How would you respond to that?
Well, you see, you have to examine the economic conditions that exist in Guyana firstly. You have people in Guyana who are in abject poverty. That is no small secret. I mean, we know that there are conditions under which some pockets of individuals, pockets of communities, and so on, live in Guyana. That really they are at a point of having nothing, and they have not had anything in the past. That is not a secret or so. It's a reason why where we have come from. It's as a result of a historical condition. Now, I think because we are coming from where we are coming from, the base is so low that given what we are going through, given what will be happening in the future, each person will materially have a different standard of living simply by being in Guyana. Simply by being able to, and this goes back to the original 5 things that I would have mentioned, simply by being able to access better infrastructure, the multiple highways being built, time saved in traffic, more time to spend with children, more time to spend with family, able to access in a much easier way one's elderly grandmother who may live in a rural community, etc. Those meaningful elements of development that are really welfare improving for an individual, they are going to happen simply because of where we are coming from. That is perhaps the most important thing. Secondly, I think because of the administration's emphasis on education in particular, and ensuring you have this broad-based, widely accessible, non-discriminatory educational type of system through the gold program, through supporting in some of the largest budgetary allocations for the education sector. I think that by itself will provide the opportunities for young persons to be able to qualify themselves and be internationally competitive so that they can enjoy a high standard of living as well as being technical in their field, whether it's a TVET field, whether it's an academic field, whether it's whichever field it is that they're operating in. And so those two items there really will drive home that reduction of inequality. And so focusing on the big ticket items are important because those are the things, Guyana, that make a difference in the lives of people. You know, if you think about where we have come from, there was a time in Guyana, if one wanted to do a graduate program, given the state of education in the country, you'd then have to go overseas. And we know what happened. People go overseas, they become attracted to the life that's being lived there, and it's an incentive for them to stay. They have to spend time away from their families, etc., and then eventually they take their families there. Now someone can access education from the comfort of their home while still maintaining a full-time job, having to take no career break, being able to spend time with their families in the evening. And I'm only using those two elements to demonstrate how the standard of living and the welfare of individuals, it's already improving. And when we remember or recall where we come from in terms of where we have been historically, heavily indebted poor country, one of the lowest per capita GDPs in the Western Hemisphere, etc., the sheer magnitude of what is happening, the sheer magnitude of what will happen, and the level of opportunities that will be available once one is able to align oneself in a fashion that you are competent, you have a plan, you are deliberate about your actions, and you are disciplined enough to push towards your goals. I think that Guyana provides the conditions and will provide even better conditions in the future through which anyone can access. Not to belabor the point, but let me just make a very succinct analogy so that one is able to understand in a much more meaningful way. You think about persons who maybe traditionally have not had anything, their families and so on have not accumulated capital, for example. Someone is now able to say, I'll start a small store in a mall. I will endeavor to go through entrepreneurship. I will, push my small business. I will take those types of opportunities, or I will undertake an educational program. I will aim to work with a multinational company or with a company here in Guyana that is operating in some sector. And so the point that I'm trying to make is that the opportunities are so abound that Guyanese will benefit from what is happening, and the standard of living is improving every day and will continue to improve.
Thank you very much for that commentary there, Richard. Now, this takes us to the next aspect of our discussion this evening, and this shifts a bit to the Natural Resource Fund, which is an important vehicle for public wealth management and moving savings and investments from present to future. Now, first off, Richard, I'd like to extend congratulations to you on your appointment to serve on the NRS Investment Committee. You're one of the youngest appointees, and that says a lot for youth representation on such an important body. So congratulations. Now, with that said, I'd like to have your take on, just a simplified explanation of what is the purpose of this committee and a bit about how the NRF can truly help this country in stabilizing budget deficits.
All right, so maybe it's useful for us to understand firstly what the Natural Resource Fund is. So the Natural Resource Fund is essentially a sovereign wealth fund. And what does that mean? It means that the wealth of the sovereign goes into a fund. That is what it is. The wealth of the state goes into a fund. I've been explaining what sovereign wealth funds are for some time and trying to simplify it over time. The monies that we obtain from the petroleum sector, they are deposited into the fund. When a country has money, it can either do one of two things with it. Think about it also at your individual level. You have money, you can do either one of two things with it. You can either save it or you can spend it. When you save it, you put it up and it's there quietly. You extract some funds and you spend. That's at an individual level. If you take it to a macro level, money is put aside and saved. Money is extracted and spent on various sectors that the government has its programs for. And so that's why you see government extracting money from the Sovereign Wealth Fund, from the Natural Resource Fund, placing it into the program of work, which is represented by the budget, and executing. Because that's the program of work of government. But if you think about it, you have all of this money sitting there that you have saved. Do you just want to keep it there and save it and just say, let's leave it? No. When you're dealing with large sums of money, especially at the national level, or even corporations, some corporations do this, they then take the savings and they invest it in safe assets globally, so that you are able to earn a rate of return and the money that is sitting there is not eaten away by inflation. Because if you have maybe, let's say, $500 million as savings, $500 million today will not be the same $500 million 20 years from now. Because inflation will have its corroding impact on the money. But if you take that same savings and you're able to invest it smartly into safe assets around the world, which are able to give you, those assets are able to give you a rate of return, then you also are able to earn from your savings. And so the benefit that you will get is obviously you're able to mitigate the inflationary impact. Inflation might be, let's say, 5%, but you are able to earn 10% on the international market. You benefit from 5% in a real term. You're able to benefit from that 10% return. And so the inflation of 5% doesn't have an impact. So it's very important for persons to bear in mind that at a basic level, that's what the Sovereign Wealth Fund is. It's obviously much more complex and much more layered than that. But in a very elementary sense, that is what the Sovereign Wealth Fund does. Keep some of the money for future generations. By investing it, you mitigate the inflationary impact of holding large amounts of cash. Some is extracted and spent on budget priorities and government programs so as to better the lives of people today. And it has a couple of important impacts. The Sovereign Wealth Fund, or Natural Resource Fund in Guyana's case, has a couple of very important impacts. Firstly, it is able to hold some money for future generations. So that's what we call intergenerational transfer of wealth. Secondly, it is able to, the technical term for it is smooth out cyclical fluctuations. But essentially what it is able to do, we know that oil prices go up and down. But if you are putting the money into the fund and you are smartly investing it, etc., and you are not just taking the money that you earn from the petroleum sector and putting it straight into the government's hand and saying, look, spend. you are not creating the conditions under which the government has 100 million today from selling 100 million barrels at $1 per barrel. And then when the price drops to 25 cents, you get 25% of the revenues that you would have had. So that is what you mean. That's what we mean when we talk about smoothing out cyclical fluctuations or price volatility. Because what it does is that it gives the government a very stable source of revenue by firstly depositing it into the fund. So bear in mind that you have peaks and you have troughs. How do you counteract peaks and troughs of prices? You try to take an average, right? So you try to take an average of it. And so in the times when government has a high amount of revenue, they're not pushing the envelope and saying, let's extract everything today and we'll spend everything today, etc. And in the times when nothing is coming in, you're still expecting to spend high. Now, this is the mistake, for example. I don't want to particularly go into countries, etc., that have done so, but this is the mistake that some countries have made in the past. And where countries run into trouble is that they oftentimes, remember, government spends in two ways. Government spends on capital, which is infrastructure projects, big spending, building roads, etc. Capital works, but they also spend on current expenditure, which is essentially administration, paying salaries, and such the like. In some countries, what they do is that they take money from the Natural Resource Fund or from the Sovereign Wealth Fund, and they support a heavy amount of current expenditure. So, paying persons exorbitant amounts of salaries, lots of dietary, buying a lot of food and elaborate things and that kind of thing, and not really spending on priority items, which can then have a long-term impact. So the Natural Resource Fund plays a very important role in the architecture of the macroeconomic management, in the sense that it is able to help to save for the future, it's able to smooth out price volatility, and it's able to really act as a vehicle through which you can mitigate inflationary impacts that are a natural feature of an economic of economic life. So those are some of the ways, of course, in simplifying the Natural Resources Fund, and some of the ways in which it is utilized in the economy.
Thanks, Richard. Now, the committee that you're on, what role will that body play in the spending of the oil resources, the oil revenues?
Sure. So those persons who would like to perhaps read about exactly what the committee is responsible for can check the Natural Resource Fund Act of 2021. Section 8 speaks to the investment committee and its functions in intimate detail. But just for our simplistic example that we're using, the investment committee is essentially responsible for, remember I would have mentioned some of the money would be saved?
Yes.
And some of that same savings is then invested in the international instruments. That is the role of the investment committee, to determine, at its core, that is what the role is, to determine where to invest, the safe assets to invest in, and to look at market conditions to ensure that the country is not essentially investing in something that is high risk and will be bad for the fund.
Now, Richard, do you think with the structure that we have in place for our NRF, the legislation, etc., do you think Guyana can be a model state on how to do this the right way? Because there's a large percentage actually of countries that have misused natural resource funds as opposed to the success stories. Do you think we have the necessary mechanisms in place to ensure we fall into that percentile that is a success with such a mechanism?
I would say, Kiana, that we are already an example. Why are we already an example? Obviously, there will be space for improvement. We are young in as an oil and gas producer, and there obviously will be areas that you can improve. That goes without saying. But I would say that as a young producer, a nascent producer of oil, we have already demonstrated that we are an example to follow. There are countries that operate for decades without the implementation of a sovereign wealth fund. And when the price volatility happens, when the price is fluctuating in the international market for oil, countries feel it in major ways. They then have to go into major budget deficits. They obviously have to get the money from somewhere, so they then borrow, so they rack up their debt, or they then print more money to finance their current expenditure. That can push you into an inflationary situation. So the early implementation of the sovereign wealth fund is, especially in the form that it is, but I'll get to that, but the early implementation of the sovereign wealth fund means that we are already on the right path. That's the first thing. Secondly, in implementing the sovereign wealth fund, especially this revised version of the sovereign wealth fund that was passed in December 2021, the rules, the fiscal rule and the withdrawal rule, especially for the fund, are so clear that you do not need an investment analyst, an economist, or someone with a high amount of technical understanding to be able to calculate it. The rules are very clear as to how government must withdraw. Why is that important? Because it then puts Guyanese, the citizens of the country, in a position that they are able to hold the government accountable for their actions with the sovereign wealth fund. There are countries around the world where there is no idea as to the withdrawal rule. It is not clear. It's not clearly delineated. Of course, you would recall that in the first iteration of the Natural Resources Fund in 2019, we would have spoken about that complex rule. It took me about 24 hours literally of working on it to try to understand where it was. I eventually figured it out, but it was very complex. And so that is extraordinarily important. That's the second thing. Thirdly, because you have in place the sovereign wealth fund, you are able to better manage your budget and pay keener attention to your budget deficit and how you finance your budget deficit. Why this is important? We oftentimes hear in Guyana about the resource curse. Yeah. But one of the things that we don't often hear about is something called the pre-source curse. Yeah. Now, the pre-source curse is essentially you borrowing as against expected or future income. If you have a sovereign wealth fund in place and you understand how you are mapping your expected revenue from the sovereign wealth fund into your budget deficit, you are in a better position to plan, and you are in a better position to avoid heavy amounts of borrowing against future revenues. Countries that tend to run into the pre-source curse, which of course, for those who don't know, it's essentially borrowing against heavy amounts of expected future revenues. Those countries, resource-rich developing economies, usually do not have sovereign wealth funds in place. And so those are three tangible ways that the Natural Resource Fund and its implementation in its current form has been able to help. We can go on for some time on it because it's a very useful multidimensional instrument that is used in macroeconomic management. But its early implementation, the way that it's structured, and the fact that we are already utilizing it will mean that we are able to mitigate many of the impacts that would have otherwise been had. would I have answered your question in its entirety there, or?
Absolutely, Richard. And that takes me to the next aspect of our discussion this evening, and that has to do with the performance of the economy. The government released the mid-year report,
Yes.
and there have been quite a few perspectives on what the numbers actually say about the economic health of the country. And
Including Kaieteur News' front page.
yes. So I'd like to have your take on what the mid-year report says for you with respect to the performance of the oil economy and the non-oil economy. And in addition to that, there are fears by some that the domination of the oil and gas sector, the fact that it already accounts for more than 50% of GDP, spells a really troubling picture for our non-oil economy. Do you think those fears are misplaced or justified? So that's my question.
Okay.
Those are my questions
Sure.
about that.
Sure. All right. Great. So, as you can imagine, once again, I will have to be pretty extensive in the response to that, because it is very layered in the way that it's. But I'll try to go through it. Firstly, the newspaper for which you're a senior journalist at would have put on the front page that a couple of sectors, some main sectors, are in decline. That sugar contracted, rice contracted, gold contracted.
Yes.
Or let's deal with those big ticket ones, but also manufacturing contracted. So let me deal with sugar, rice, and gold. We are in an economy where we do not have advanced technological implementation being done in our agriculture sector as yet. It's being done to a small scale, but it is not by and large the ethos of the agricultural sector to be at the cutting edge of technology, perhaps the way that Brazil is. And so the impact that adverse weather conditions have on sectors such as sugar, on sectors such as rice. Let's deal with those two first. It is something that we will eventually have to move towards ensuring we have climate smart, climate friendly, and climate resilient agriculture being done. But at this juncture, we are still in the transition of doing it. And so the inclement weather and the heavy and torrential rainfall and unpredictable weather patterns, essentially us feeling the impact of the very real impact of climate change, is having a deleterious effect on the sugar and the rice sectors. This is the reason you see it in decline. It is not as a result of government policy, government's inaction, or government's lack of programmatic work to support the sector, as perhaps has been in the past. I just wanted to put that in. As we had seen, in 2016, 17, 18, thereabouts. Wanted to start from that point. Those same climatic conditions have also a strong impact on the gold sector. If you look carefully at the mid-year report, you will see that there has been a disaggregation between what has happened for large-scale gold mining,
and the small,
but then what has happened for the persons who operate at an artisanal level.
Yes.
It is because those persons that are operating at that small scale cannot employ the technologies, do not have sophisticated equipment, etc., to be able to mitigate the reality of climate change. It is unfortunately a fact that exists. And it is unfortunate too that the reality of climate change is upon us, which will, of course, bring us to one of our topics later on about LCDS and sustainable development, etc. But so that deals with 3 of the 4 main sectors that have been in decline, or that did not record positive rates of growth over the first half of 2022. Let me be specific with it. Manufacturing in particular, there is no serious analyst would look at manufacturing and say nobody is doing anything, or this is what has happened in the manufacturing sector is as a result of some deliberate thing, or some deliberate policy, or some inaction or ineffectiveness. The manufacturing sector obviously has been strongly impacted by the increase in input prices as well as soaring fuel prices. We have to remember that many of these many of the manufacturers that exist depend on fossil fuel. They depend on oil prices. They also depend on inputs that are not manufactured locally, or not produced locally, or not available locally. And thus there is all of what is happening in the international market having an impact on the manufacturing sector. If you look at the price for some of the inputs, some of them have gone up 300%, 400%. And manufacturers are doing as much as they possibly can. All depends on their profit margin, how much they can actually absorb before they have to pass the costs on to consumers. Now, we understand elementary economics, even at a basic level. We know that once the price begins to increase, and there are competing alternatives with price increases, that someone will consume less because obviously it's more expensive. I believe that is what really has had an impact on the manufacturing sector. So I wanted to deal frontally with those sectors that were in decline and demonstrate in a pellucid fashion that those sectors that did not experience the positive rates of growth in 2022 first half is not as a result of inaction, it's not as a result of bad program, it's not a result of antagonistic policies, but really they are external and exogenous factors that have had a strong mitigating impact on what was anticipated to happen. So that is the first aspect of it. I think persons are being disingenuous, however, if they look at the mid-year report and they see all bad. The reason why is that if you look at the non-oil economies' rate of growth over the first half of the year, it still is 8.3%, if I'm not mistaken. It's upward of 8%. Obviously, the oil economy is growing, and as an economist operating in a developing economy, I try not to focus too much on that, especially given where we are and ramping up production. But I think persons are being disingenuous if they look at the mid-year report and do not acknowledge an important fact. That is to say, you are seeing sectors that are growing in the Guyanese economy that are non-traditional sectors, and they are growing in a very strong way.
Yes.
You are seeing growth in wholesale and retail trade like has not been experienced before. Construction and the entire infrastructure sector is rapidly emerging. Non-traditional crops where climate resilient and climate smart agricultural technologies can be implemented, such as corn and soybean, as the president talks about quite often, His Excellency the President, as well as livestock. Those are sectors that we have in Guyana not traditionally looked at. And of course, there has been the resurgence of the bauxite sector and the forestry sector and such the like. So I think if persons are to really look at the numbers carefully, And if you understand the Guyanese economy and you understand the international economic context, you would come very quickly to the realization that had it not been for those international developments in terms of the international economic conditions, as well as the mitigating impact of weather and climatic conditions, that the Guyanese economy would have grown even stronger than it did over the first half of the year. Where I project that we will go, because I rather suspect that at some point we'll have to deal with that, where I project that we will go is only on a further positive trajectory. Why? If one is paying keen attention to international developments, you would understand that we have generally turned the tide of COVID-19 pandemic, though we still have to pay attention to its resurgence in various areas. For example, China, especially China, and the impact that can have. But we have turned the tide in a general sense. Secondly, international oil prices are beginning to come down to the extent where we may see it at pre-pandemic levels in the near future. So over the next 12 months, we are looking at changes in that direction. Freight cost is beginning to once again decline, and the supply chain issues are beginning to smooth themselves out. I think that bodes very well for Guyana. If you look also at the mid-year report, you'll see that inflation has actually been contained to about 5.6, 5.8%. This is well below the global average. Now, I'm not saying that there isn't cost of living increase in Guyana. Yes, it is happening. We import quite a lot of consumer commodities, and there is a degree of imported inflation that occurs in Guyana. But when we look at the prospects for inflation, and when we look at what has happened with inflation in Guyana, we can consider ourselves, firstly, very fortunate, and secondly, an economy that is fairly resilient, all things considered. You have some mature economies that are projecting in excess of 10% inflation for the upcoming fiscal or for the remainder of the year. If you think about what we're doing in Guyana in terms of oil and gas and that pushing the economy along and all of the other things that we're doing, and the fact that we're a small open economy integrated into the global architecture, and the fact that we consume so many goods that are imported, us being able to hold inflation well below the global average speaks volumes and is a real testament to prudent macroeconomic management. Otherwise, I shudder to think what could have happened. I want to address a couple of things, more specifically though as it relates to government intervention in the economy, because it's important that we give recognition to the fact that we are not where we are by happenstance. We are where we are as a result of some deliberate policy measures that have really had a strong impact on the Guyanese economy and really been able to offset some of that heavy amount of inflation, as well as keep our economy going. So the first I want to mention is the fact that there has been a focus on infrastructure and construction spending. And you can see the numbers also being reflected in the mid-year report. That by itself pushes funds into the economy in a way that the multiplier effect on the construction sector is so strong that it can keep the economy buoyed. All right, it can keep the economy afloat. And when we say the multiplier effect, we're essentially talking about all of the other spin-offs that occur by construction happening. You think about what happens when you build a community. Think about what happens in terms of jobs that are created, in terms of the shopkeepers, in terms of all of the other amenities that go along with a community. And so the focus on infrastructure has really helped to buoy the economy. It has really helped to keep the economic prospects bright and to ensure that aggregate demand is stimulated, if we speak in economic terms. Additionally, the reduction of excise tax on fuel down to 0% is a tool which I believe that has been utilized in the right way. And you might recall, Kiana, if you've been in the media for a long time, you might recall that I have been on public record on multiple occasions back in 2017, 18, talking about the fact that because international prices for fuel was going so high at the time, that we should reduce the excise tax. That was in 2017 or 18, thereabouts. The fact that it has declined speaks volumes to the notion that the government is responding in a pragmatic fashion to the reality of the economic conditions. So that's the second main one that I wanted to talk about. Thirdly, we know that enterprise is thriving. We see the numbers, and we know that enterprise is doing well. We know that persons are being employed. When you speak to the private sector in Guyana in particular, labor is very difficult to find. So we know that persons are being employed. But there is a grouping that exists in our society that they have not fully retooled and reskilled themselves to cater for our new economic realities, and they are currently doing so through interventions like the Gold Program. And it is important that those persons are supported by cash grants, and to ensure that those persons have livelihoods eventually that can be able to buoy them. And I think that intervention of the cash grants in a variety of ways, firstly for the persons who have been affected by adverse climatic conditions, secondly for persons who are with disabilities and vulnerable groups, etc., those cash grants act as a strong injection into the economy to ensure that no group that exists in the society is really falling below a certain minimum level. So that's the third intervention that I wanted to talk about. The fourth intervention, which we oftentimes have not given the level of credence to, is the reduction in freight to pre-pandemic levels. As I would have mentioned, we know that cost of living has increased, but we acknowledge that the cost of living increase, as demonstrated by the inflation, has not been as bad as the global average or as bad as even the Latin American and Caribbean region. It's only about 5%. That by itself, I really shudder to think, Kiana, and I'm using the terminology again, what would have happened in this country had we not had some of those policies. I suspect that our inflation level would have been double digits if those deliberate policy measures were not implemented, especially at the points in time that they were implemented. So let me wrap all of that up by addressing another important issue that I see being raised, and that is that Guyana is already suffering from the Dutch disease. And before I go into it, I want to just preface what I'm going to say by saying, yes, the oil and gas sector is large in Guyana, but yes, it's because of the size of the finds that we have and because of the urgency to extract what we have that we are ramping up production. If one pays keen attention and understands what Dutch disease is and what a natural resource curse is, more specifically operating through the channel of Dutch disease. If one understands what it is, and then you look at the mid-year report, not in a sensationalized fashion or in a fashion to get attention, but in a technical way, and you do a thorough analysis, you would know that some of the key things that are the indications of natural resources curse, or specifically Dutch disease, they are not happening. And some of those things are exchange rate appreciation. That is not happening in Guyana. We have a fairly stable rate of exchange with the US dollar. Secondly, one of the other things is that you have a massive amount of savings built up in the commercial banks. That has not been happening because the market, what we term in economics as the market for loanable funds, is now beginning to really kick off, because the commercial banks are in turn beginning to up their lending, both in terms of the quantity as well as the size. So that also is not happening. Thirdly, you are not seeing lagging sectors, save for those sectors that have been impacted by exogenous factors. I just demonstrated to you a number of non-traditional sectors in Guyana that are growing at a rapid pace. And so there is no lagging sector and booming sector as is a necessary condition in the Dutch disease thesis. It simply does not exist. And so on those 3 points only, we're not even going into other elements of it and being more technical, but on those 3 points only, Guyana is not in the condition under which Dutch disease is occurring. And so for someone to go into the public domain and to sensationalize it, etc., I think it's irresponsible, and I think that we really need to be much more careful in making pronouncements on the economy in that way, because it's a very serious matter, and it can have debilitating impacts on investors' confidence, which is an important non-economic indicator for the health of the economy, consumer as well as investor confidence. So I only wanted to say that, we are not in a bad position, especially when we look relative to what has been happening around the world. I think we are doing well. There are challenges. We are integrated into the global economic system. We cannot escape some of those impacts. But when one looks at it in an objective way and you look at the averages, etc., you will see that we are growing. Non-traditional sectors are performing. Inflation is being kept below the global as well as the Latin American and Caribbean average, and the prospects for the future continue to be bright.
Thank you, Richard. That was a very comprehensive, and I do appreciate the time that you took to truly flesh out many of those issues. Before we get to the final questions, the final two questions for the show this evening, we'll go to a quick commercial break, and when we come back, we'll wrap up our discussion this evening.
Kaieteur Radio, keeping you informed.
Demerara and Essequibo 99.1 FM.
Berbice 99.5 FM. Kaieteur Radio.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. If you're now joining us, we are wrapping up this week's episode of Guyana's Oil and You. Thus far, we've had a very comprehensive discussion with Mr. Richard Rambaran. He's an economist and finance specialist, and we have discussed quite a few issues that pertain to the Natural Resource Fund management. We've also discussed matters of inequality. And just before wrapping up the first segment of our discussion, Mr. Rambaran would have taken us through a very comprehensive commentary on the performance of the non-oil economy as well as the real economy, and he would have given us his thoughts on criticisms that the Dutch disease has gripped Guyana. So Mr. Rambaran, wrapping up our program this evening, I'd like to ask you a bit about the local content front, which is also a very key issue in the oil and gas discussion in Guyana. Now, there still appears to be some gridlock, a degree of gridlock between locals and foreign entities that are seeking to also see how they can play a role in the development of Guyana's oil and gas economy. How do you propose we overcome that gridlock?
Thank you, Kiana. Welcome back to the viewers and listeners. Now, local content and foreign investment should not be seen as mutually exclusive. There are several areas, importantly, of overlap, and I think the government has been very I want to describe it as being very grounded in the realities of local content, because Kiana, it is clearly demonstrative that if you get local content wrong, you can have negative impacts on your economy. That is no question. You can chase foreign investors away, etc., and you can really slow your growth down by deliberate attempt. I think our local content has been crafted in such an intelligent way that it provides a win-win under all conditions. And this is especially as I'm relating to foreign investment here. Why is that so? If you look at the definition of a Guyanese company, right? Put aside the labor element of it and the managerial element. But if you look at the definition from an ownership standpoint, it's 51% to be owned by Guyanese, 49% owned otherwise. Therefore, even under conditions in Schedule 1 of the Local Content Act, where a particular service may have that it must be procured at 100%, it still does not lock out foreign investment. It is only that the foreign investment or the foreign partner or the non-Guyanese partner will have to participate in a minority way. That is the point that from my private sector vantage point at the Georgetown Chamber of Commerce and Industry, that is the point that I always tell investors. Firstly, local content extends to nothing else other than just the petroleum sector. So everything else in the economy is completely open to foreign investment and is also governed by the Investment Act of 2004, which is a fantastic investment act for foreign investors. So let's start there. Then when we enter into the petroleum sector, it only has 40 areas. There are in excess of 180 areas of operation in the petroleum sector that services have to be procured from. And even in those 40 areas, you don't lock out foreigners. or non-Guyanese. I don't want to say foreigners to make it seem like if people are aliens. But you don't lock out non-Guyanese. They are still able to participate. And what I think has happened, Kiana, is that we need to ensure that that message goes far and wide. That message goes far and wide. I speak to, as you know, I've been involved with local content since the inception, from its genesis in the public domain as a discourse. And the questions that I've been answering on the legislation and the fears that non-Guyanese have about the legislation, when it is explained to them what the legislation actually says, and I show them what the legislation says, and I show them that 100% from a Guyanese company does not mean that you cannot participate, then they're like, oh, well, this is different from what we thought, or from what we heard, or from what we have been hearing from some third-party source that perhaps doesn't even live in Guyana or isn't, familiar with the laws that we have. So, for me, Kiana, I think that the local content legislation has been crafted in such an intelligent fashion, catering for all sides of the coin, that I think that we have struck the perfect balance with our legislation. Additionally, the way that our legislation is crafted and the fact that we have put the legislation in so early, it gives all players that are seeking to be involved in the sector or are already involved in the sector, it gives those players a clear, undeniable signal about where our country stands on local content. And it gives stability to investors to know this is Guyana's position on local content. This is what they're doing. This is the definition of a Guyanese company. When you're going to Guyana and if you want to participate in these areas, you must partner with Guyanese and you must go in as a minority partner. And that's it. It's clear. And investors, for somebody that has dealt with investors quite a lot, investors like nothing more than stability. They like to know that this is the legislative architecture. This is what it is. Even if I might not like it as much as maybe some other country, I know that this is what I'm getting into. And so, Kiana, we really have to go perhaps once again on a public educational campaign on local content, what the legislation says, what the various elements of the legislation mean for different persons and so on. So I think that fear, quote unquote, can be overcome through public education because the legislation is such an intelligently crafted one that strikes a good balance and caters for the reality.
Thanks, Richard. Now, this brings us to our final question, and if time permits, I'll sneak in another one. And this has to do with the LCDS, the Low Carbon Development Strategy 2030. Now, it's well known that the gas resources can bring tremendous benefits like energy security, job creation, increased revenue streams. But this is also well articulated in LCDS 2030. Yeah. But there are still sort of a difference or differing opinions on how we ought to go about the development of gas to harness those benefits that I just mentioned and which are also noted in the strategy. From your perspective, what do you think ought to be done by government to ensure that gas is a success story, to ensure that we do harness the potential this resource holds?
We bring it on shore and we ensure we convert it to energy. That is the single most transformative project that can happen in the Guyanese economy. The LCDS maps very nicely into the Sustainable Development Goals and what the Sustainable Development Goals are trying to achieve. So we have a modern and a cutting-edge development strategy for our country. Where I think the conversation then pivots and becomes very important is in Guyana's future as an oil producer, a producer of gas, and a country that is going along a low carbon path. I wanted specifically to raise a point on this show because it's a conversation that has not been explored in the public domain as yet fully. In 2040, it is estimated that there will be global demand for about 20 million barrels of oil per day. This is whilst the sustainable energy mix is happening and the energy transition is occurring. There needs to be, at some point in time, a conversation for what type of crude is included in that 20 million barrels of oil in 2040. In the sense that we have in Guyana light sweet crude, which has the lowest carbon footprint from extraction all the way to final product. In the future, when we speak about that 20 million barrels of oil that will be demanded in 2040 estimated, we have to ensure that we are part of that conversation, and we have to ensure that it is clearly articulated that Guyana and other similarly circumstanced producers of crude, that is light sweet crude, that we are able to include ourselves in that, as opposed to heavy sour crude. The conversation will eventually happen, in my view. 5 years from now, I'm sure that it will become something even more prominent in the discourse. But it's something I wanted to raise here because we are in a fortuitous position in Guyana. We are in a very good position to make the case that we need to be part of that 20 million. That's the first point. Secondly, I don't see the alternatives, going back to specifically what you asked, I don't see the alternatives of the use of gas to be better than the option of piping it onshore, ensuring energy security, ensuring economic resilience and resilience to international shocks from oil prices, and the use of that transitional energy of gas as a cleaner form of energy than heavy fuel oils used in diesel generators. I don't see any of the alternatives of reinjection, flaring, etc., which is of course setting up a floating liquefied plant offshore. I don't see any of those realities, as any of those options, as being as good as the one to pipe it onshore and transform that natural capital that we have into a key for unlocking growth with one of our sharpest and most impacting constraints to doing business, which is the cost of electricity. And not just doing business, but existing. Can you imagine a future, Kiana, where instead of a household having to spend how much ever, let's maybe say 20% of their income on an electricity bill, being able to spend just about 5%? Can you imagine a future where enterprises no longer have to make heavy upfront capital investment because they need to come off the grid and they have to get reliable source of power? Can you imagine what that will do for the competitiveness of our manufacturing sector? Can you imagine what that will do in terms of job creation, in terms of spurring other forms of economic activities? Can you imagine what the generation of such magnitude of power can do for the development of a petrochemical industry around the energy plant? So the broader economic benefits that will accrue far outweigh firstly, what the potential financial cost is. Secondly, the alternatives that exist. And then thirdly, the prospects for driving growth along in Guyana. It is almost something that has to be done. I don't know what more I can actually say, because I don't want to use the term that it's a no-brainer, but really, I mean, when you look at it, it is. It is. You have to pipe the natural gas onshore, do the conversion, ensure that we have that strong energy source, and ensure that also we are part of the conversation on our crude being part of the 20 million barrels of oil per day. That does not in any way mitigate our position in the global discussion on carbon, and Guyana as being a sequester of carbon, a net sequester of carbon. When the international market for carbon reaches maturity and it's fully developed, one will see that Guyana is actually one of the leaders as a country in the production of crude that has a low carbon footprint, in ensuring that we have clean energy, and in ensuring that we still have pristine forest cover in Guyana. So I just wanted to make those points, and I know you have another question you might want to
Yes, I do. Thank you very much for that, Richard. And to conclude, I'd like to know your thoughts on what you think will be the biggest battle for Guyana in managing the oil sector, or do you think it would be an easy ride?
Well, managing a country can never be an easy ride. The biggest challenge that we'll face, I think the biggest challenge that we will face is our own culture and our own cynicism that we have as Guyanese people. We have to be responsible stewards of our destiny as a country. We have to ensure that we are not overly cynical about every single thing that happens. We have to ensure that we are critical in a constructive fashion, and that in criticizing in a constructive fashion, that we offer alternative policy solutions. We have had a culture in Guyana over time that everything that happens or everything that is happening, we find a little fault, or we find one of the negative experiences that have been happening around the world. We take that and wholesale transplant it to Guyana, create the worst possible outcome in our minds, and then run with that as being something that is a self-evident truth. And what it does sometimes is that it creates a scenario where you begin to have some amount of cognitive dissonance, in the sense that the reality is that a particular project, a particular action will be beneficial, but we aren't even seeing that it will be beneficial. You know how many countries around the world, even some of our neighbors, would be happy to be in the position that we are in now. The point that I'm trying to make with it, Kiana, is that we have to ensure in Guyana that we do not become our own worst enemies, that we continue to be responsible stewards of the conversation, that we are not making cynical, ungrounded remarks, that when discussions come up, that we approach them in a mature fashion, that we dialogue, that we ensure that we have healthy debates that can toss up through the dialectical process. It tosses up new ideas. We have to also ensure that we respect each other and understand that there are varying perspectives, but there is also fact. And I find that we are a society, sometimes we like to run away from what is the fact. And that really, for me, Kiana, more than any economic policy or instrument or legislative reform, etc. You can do all of that right. But if the culture that you have is not growth facilitating and growth accommodating, you can be your own worst enemy. You can be, as a collective, I'm talking about a collective, you as Guyanese people, not the singular you as a particular person, but you as Guyanese people, you can end up becoming your own worst enemy. We also have to understand that when we speak about issues in a particular way and we sensationalize issues and we make things out to be more than they are or worse than they are for selfish reasons or for attention, etc., that we have to understand that that can have an overall negative impact on the economy, that can harm consumer confidence, that can harm investors' confidence, that can create bad expectations about what will happen in the future and change the entire plan for someone who otherwise might have brought a great benefit to the country. We have come a very far way as a country. We were a heavily indebted poor country. We had heavy rates of abject poverty in Guyana. We have a good opportunity to be able to change the economic reality for the Guyanese citizens and for especially some of the most vulnerable persons in our society. And I think if we are responsible stewards, we will be able to have that done.
On that a very positive and enlightening note, Mr. Rambaran, I'd like to thank you for being part of tonight's edification, the discussion that is truly crucial to not just our current circumstances, but also to our future. And we truly appreciate the time you took to provide your perspectives, which were enriching to the conversation, a national conversation. And as you said, being responsible stewards of the debate on the oil and gas sector. So once again, Mr. Rambaran, thank you for being part of the program. And to our viewers on Facebook Live, YouTube, and to our listeners wherever you might be, thank you for joining the discussion this week. And we look forward to having you same time, same place next week, where we continue the discussion on our oil and gas industry. Until then, do have a wonderful evening. Please continue to be safe.
Thank you, Kiana. Good night, everyone.